Those of you who remember the MRC epidemiology unit will remember it as a warren of rooms. And up at the very, very top, we had what was called the attic. And that's where Archie had his spare desk. And all the very junior researchers were piled in there. And we'd take it in turns to make Archie coffee. And next door there was the statistician's room. And then next door to that there was the dietitian's room. And then at the very bottom, there was the, if you like, the heartbeat of the whole thing, which was the field workers' room. And I think we have representatives of each of these micro environments. But the beauty of it was that Peter was in every room. So it would just be really nice for you to get a flavour of how life was in the unit. And also we have somebody from the policy end. We have Dame Deirdre Hine, who knew Peter at a much higher level than us, even though we were up in the rarefied altitude of the attic. And so what I'd like to do is just invite you to come along one at a time now and stand here so that we can capture everything for the wider audience. So first of all, Dame Deirdre, please come and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's a real privilege to be here today to say a few words about Peter Elwood, scientist, epidemiologist, researcher, teacher, public health physician, and as he's now become known, Mr. Aspirin. But it was an even greater privilege to have known Peter as a colleague for the whole of my professional lifetime. As both an undergraduate and a postgraduate student of Archie Cochrane, it was inevitable that I came across Peter as Archie's right-hand man in the long-running Caerphilly study. But as the years passed, he became a leader in the field of epidemiological research in his own right, and as director of the MRC in Wales, was a constant source of advice and support to two successive chief medical officers for Wales. My predecessor, Professor Gareth Crompton, has asked me to pass on his gratitude to Peter for the many occasions on which he provided advice and support to him as he did to me in my turn. Advice and support always given with the generosity, care and courtesy that is Peter's hallmark. I also recall the occasion when, as a mere jobbing specialist in community medicine, I relied heavily on his help in organising the annual conference of the Faculty of Community Medicine, as it was then, now Faculty of Public Health, which was held for the first time in Cardiff. The year was 1986. Does that ring a bell anywhere? The year of the Chernobyl disaster. Perhaps the most difficult decision we had to make was whether to go ahead with our original intention to serve roast well lamb at the conference dinner. This in the context that that lamb had been reared on the possibly contaminated slopes of Welsh mountains. If we went ahead, there might be justifiable concern. But if we changed the menu, it would have tantamount to suggest some concern about the safety of a major Welsh agricultural product. Should we serve the lamb, accompanied by a Geiger counter on each table, as suggested by the inevitable Wagaman, our colleagues? Suffice it to say that Peter was his usual informed, intelligent, and placid source of advice and support, and the dinner went ahead, as planned, with the blessing of the then President Rosemary Rue, and minus the Geiger counter. Many years later, it was my pleasure and privilege to chair one of Peter's conferences on the subject of his work on aspirin, which has been now so widely recognised. Richard Doll once somewhat wryly observed to me when he was accepting the Shaw Prize of $1 million that epidemiologists don't often get given prizes. That is sadly so, but in Peter's case, this gathering today and the contributions that we've heard from so many distinguished epidemiologists is, in his honour, is surely better than any cash prize. Wales has been so fortunate that Peter has made Cardiff and Wales both his home and his workplace for so many years. And I'm honoured to represent the city and the country in acknowledging the superb contribution he has made to both. As Gareth would have said if he were here, da iawn and diolch yn fawr. Well done and thank you, Peter.
Now, known for his dry wit, Hugh was a member of the Attic, and he then went over to the other side and became medically qualified. Hugh.
Thank you. It's my slide.
I'll get that.
There we are. It's my one slide. I'm keeping it fairly concise. I'll aim for 5 minutes, but I think really in an event like this, really, which is remembering and honouring Peter Elwood, we focused on aspirin. I'll come back to some personal recollections a bit later. What I'm very much aware of is just this wide range of interests, really. As a polymath, and I'd like to make this as 2 points. I've had to gauge what's gone on today and decide, what I ought to say and not say. But in fact, as a polymath, within the Medical Research Council, I think when he was reviewed, these terrible events that used to happen every couple of years, no one could really believe the range of activities that he was taking involvement in, but actually contributing to. And I actually think he gave a lot of us employment, and I think he's also currently giving a lot of meta-analysis employment as well. He just had such a range. I've worked in particularly the field of environmental and occupational health. And in fact, even some of his studies later on, following up the slate workers, the bicinosis workers, cotton workers, even sisal workers, the rope manufacturers. I found when I read his MD thesis, which was in the 1960s, that although it was a very detailed account of about 1,000 men, it had never been published, and I wrote it up when I did my medical elective at the unit. That was published then. He's created such a vast amount of information, original information, that really it almost belies anything that people would believe these days, so people would get on and do it. But I say as a polymath within the academic world, the medical world, I was one of the technical staff, I should say. Fred Moore, who worked in the unit, to find the technical staff, we had the ones who had headaches. If you were scientific staff, you had a migraine. And we normally rang it as a time out. But anyway, his particular interest there, I know in addition, and many of you might know this, his expertise in astronomy, in music. He's a very good pianist and loves Bach. I think he's waiting when he goes to the other side to see what Bach's been composing in all these years since his departure. He's a keen ornithologist and a student of biblical theology, and for many years was a lay pastor in the church in Pontypridd. So I'd see that then as a polymath, just this whole range, and we've touched on some of the subjects that he's contributed to, but I'm sure, I don't know if he's ever kept a record of his publications. He must have a number. I think Richard Doll told me that his was about 900, but I'm sure Peter can't be far behind. We sometimes look on ResearchGate and things like that. David Strachan said to me, it's an exercise in narcissism, really, to see how many people have cited your work. But I'm sure, as we know, papers like the Aspirin study are just worldwide. And that's why in the backdrop, I've got the map of the world really showing how from this one unit in South Wales, it's the worldwide influence. But an enthusiast as well for all these different ideas. He would research them and say, this is what we ought to be doing. And I always remember Shirley Adikoff, our beloved Cardiff librarian, used to say if there's any setback in the unit, Peter would come bouncing in, just telling about the new project we were going to do. And he just turned to me once and said, Hugh, where does he get his enthusiasm from? And there's always something that could be done and was worth doing, and we got on and did it. A team worker then, we touched on that, usually small teams of field workers, but he drew in large numbers of collaborators, such as general practitioners, pathologists, laboratory scientists. The thing is, he expected his team to work hard, but he also led by example. He worked very hard himself. So an encourager, really, and that's been one of the things that's come out of this meeting today, really. Fellow scientific, technical, and administrative staff, many of us here can testify to this. And he was generous in working on papers and so on, giving us first authorship if we worked hard. And the many practical lessons that I learned from him, his wise advice in writing up research was that the first draft was the most difficult, but you had to get on and do that. And make sure that you date and number your revisions. As we've all probably know from bitter experience, you look back and think, what was this all about? When did I do it? You're normally horrified that it was last month or last year that you actually worked on those drafts there. Don't let the hold-ups, so there are hold-ups in any particular projects or publications, don't let them be due to you. So that was always, at our Friday morning meetings, we all sat there sometimes feeling guilty or sometimes proud if we'd achieved things, but aware really that he was, in his own expression, keep things moving, which is why I think he's had such a productive research life. He was good at encouraging, cheering many of us in our work and achieving much more than we would have done without him. Finally, I put resilience there. So you probably don't know that he's had a lifelong, not struggle, but he's dealt with that, his asthma really there. He's taken inhalers as and when required. I was reflecting, I think it was many salbutamol he had. I don't think he's been on steroids for the whole of his life. But he's dealt with that. And as a medical student, he had TB and had to take a year out of his studies to do that. And that's helped develop his wider interests. But also had the challenge really of competing, with other things. Anyone who's got on and achieved what he has in life, it doesn't come straightforwardly as well. There are other challenges from different colleagues, people who think you could have done it better, people who wonder why you're doing it at all. And it's so gratifying to see that people from the MRC here today, really, because over the years, sometimes there's been challenges, really. But I think when they've looked at the productivity, and I used to say we're a bit of a womble, really, that you can go around and there's so much data that we've produced that's of value in contributing now, that it's really a great investment that's gone into the MRC unit for relatively little expenditure. And these are the challenge sometimes of unfair TV documentaries, and other people in academic institutions haven't made his life easy. He's dealt with all these. He doesn't talk about them openly, particularly to different people, but we're all aware he's dealt with them in a very dignified and patient manner. I certainly thought when the Aspirin meeting, I recollected as a student, I did a first degree in environmental sciences. I knew him in Cardiff at that time. And when he said in Cardiff he was going to Oxford for the day, I said, can I come with you really? I'd never been to Oxford, and it was in those days, believe it, I think the late 60s, 1970. A day out in Oxford from Cardiff was quite an exciting event. So I wandered around the town and he came back and got in the car. He was full of his enthusiasm. And I think at a meeting there chaired by Sir Richard Doll, and I think they got the go-ahead for one of the studies there. And Sir Richard Doll had summed it up, saying there's as much evidence that aspirin works as there is probably for half the drugs in the British pharmacopoeia. So we got the green light to lead on some of these studies. So I've been privileged to work with him when I did BSc projects and help with the unit, when I did my master's project help there. As a student elective as well, as a medical student, he managed to arrange not just my stay there for 6 months, but also a salary which helped us off my young friend. And then in the final days, I was there between 1995 and 1999. In a sense, that was decommissioning the unit. I'm not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing I was doing, but he kept the research going and worked on things there. Peter Sweeten sends his best wishes. He's sorry he can't be here today, isn't true. But we handed a lot of the stuff over to Bristol, to George Davies Smith and others, and just the sheer vast amount of knowledge and information that we've got, and that John's touched on as well with Biobank. So it's been a privilege and a great benefit working with him. And I am thankful that I can say this when he's able to hear it. Rather, I'd never be given this length of time at a funeral oration. Thank you very much indeed.
So at the very bottom of the building was the library, also the field workers room, and the matriarch was Janie. So if you wanted to know anything, like who lived at number 53 in a particular road in the Rhondda, Janie would know. So Janie, I'm sure you have plenty you could say, but I'm looking forward to what you will say.
Thank you for that, John. I joined the MRC Epidemiology Unit in Cardiff, almost straight from Union School after A-levels in 1964. to become one of Dr. Elwood's team. I worked with him on all the studies he led from then on, and we developed an exceptionally strong working relationship. But even so, and despite his insistence, I have never aspired to call him anything other than Dr. Elwood. Although I look back on our working relationship together as productive and successful, and I was thrilled to play a part in so many important and influential studies, I do recall one time when the strength of our relationship was tested. About 50 odd years ago, when I had just passed my driving test, and our survey clinic was to be held in a town with a Welsh name unpronounceable, I protested that I had never driven anywhere as far away as that, hoping that he would agree to be the driver on that occasion. His reply was, well, now's your chance to learn. At that time, I thought that reply was most uncharacteristic of him, and I was horrified. However, I have never stopped thanking him for making me drive that distance, and thereafter was confident to drive to destinations all over the UK. And similarly, there were plenty of other occasions when my own self-confidence was lacking. Dr. Elwood encouraged me to take on increased responsibility and try out new things, helping me to learn and develop throughout my time working with him. Through him, I had the opportunity to work with and get to know so many interesting and influential people, some of whom I'm thrilled to see here again today. I was greatly honored too when, at his insistence, my name appeared as a contributor on lots of his papers, even though all of my training for work on epidemiological studies was done under his tuition and by observing him, and not at university, like most of the esteemed colleagues I worked with. You could say I learned on the job. I was thrilled to be asked to be one of the people he chose to accompany him to Buckingham Palace when he was honored by the Queen. When the time came for me to retire in 2007, I wondered how on earth I would fill my time and how I would deal with the void left as I was no longer involved in the excitement of all the studies. I needn't have worried. We meet up very frequently for coffee, and I'm filled in with all the things that he's still involved with, and I get copies of all the papers he still writes for journals. I feel honored, very honored, to be invited here today to pay tribute to this wonderful man who made my working life so memorable and interesting, and from whom I have learned such a lot. Thank you.
So key to the epidemiology units were the statisticians, and actually we have three here today. We have Barbara Butland, Liz Lim, and Janet Pickering. And Janet Pickering is going to represent the Statisticians Union by giving her reflections.
I'm sure many of you think that working from home is something that arrived with the pandemic, but I'd like to tell you that in fact it was invented in 1991, it was invented by Peter, and he invented it for me. I was living in Wiltshire at the time, as I still do, and thinking about returning to work after a break to have children. And Peter suggested I could return to working as a statistician at the MRC Epidemiology Unit using a computer from home and just coming to Cardiff once a month. It worked so well that I continued to work on Caerphilly projects with Peter from home for the next 27 years. But I first met Peter in 1980, when I just completed my master's degree in applied statistics here in Oxford at Green College. And I wrote to Peter, in fact, at Richard Peto's suggestion, he was my college tutor at the time, and I asked if the MRC unit needed a statistician. Luckily it did, and this led to me starting work at Richmond Road. Under Peter's direction, it was an extremely exciting, inspiring, and stimulating place to work. As has already been mentioned, I shared the attic rooms with several people who are speaking here today: John Gallagher, Andrew Beswick, Hugh Thomas, and very memorably with Archie Cochrane. who in his retirement was following up men from his pneumoconiosis study. Archie particularly delighted in distracting us young researchers with his daily efforts to do the Times cryptic crossword. One of my chief memories of Richmond Road is the stimulating and slightly frightening Friday morning meetings when we were encouraged by Peter to present our work to our colleagues. The presentation was then discussed over coffee with kindly criticism from around the table. Peter was a very generous director, often with his wife Margaret entertaining the team at his home and making sure we all had a chance to meet distinguished visitors to the unit. He also liked to check we were working hard. I was ticked off on more than one occasion for working with my office door closed. Back to 1991, and I continued to work from home until Peter's official retirement in 1995. Of course, he didn't retire at all, but threw himself into new projects with renewed enthusiasm. Many an email I received began, "Janet, I'm on a high." And even after setbacks, he came bouncing back with new ideas and suggestions. My trips to Cardiff became unnecessary as Peter happily drove down the M4 for meetings over coffee or lunch in Malmesbury. He was usually accompanied by Janie, who's just spoken, and often brought new researchers with him he hoped to collaborate and who had given him a new idea for something we could look at in the Caerphilly data. So I want to say to Peter, thank you for giving me such a useful, interesting and enjoyable working life. You always made me feel a trusted and valued member of your team. Thank you.
So Peter's powers of encouragement did not end with the closure of the MRC epidemiology unit. He came back to work part-time in the Department of Primary Care and Public Health at the university and passed on his wisdom to yet another generation of researchers, one of whom is here today, Julieta.
Well, thank you very much, John, for organizing this and for inviting me here. It's a real honor. Yes, so this is back in 2010, and I was one of those international PhD students for whom pretty much everything was new regarding life in the UK. And I must say, I understood even less about the UK and its research environment than I understand today. So that was quite a lot that I had to learn. I had just done a course with the Cochrane collaboration. There's a branch in Latin American branch. So I had just done a course in Argentina and Buenos Aires, where I'm from. And I was trying to register the title with the Cochrane collaboration. So when I got to Cardiff, I was already over the moon because I got a scholarship and John trusted me over Skype, an interview on Skype. He trusted me that I was going to be a suitable PhD student, and he gave me the scholarship. I already couldn't believe that. And then when I get to Cardiff, I find out I was going to share my office with Archie Cochrane's successor. So for me, Cochrane was a name like, you know, in the outer space. And suddenly I'm there and I'm sitting next to Peter. So it blew my mind. But then I met Peter beyond his role with Cochrane, and that blew my mind way more. So we all know at this point, I think we heard a lot about his academic achievements, but what I was most struck by was Peter's way of being an academic and his way of being a person, really. Today, I still struggle to find people with values more beautiful than his, and who dare to live up to them fully. Of course, this is easier if you can't recognize a brick wall, Peter, I know. Your mom has tried really hard to teach you this, but it's not her fault. I know that as well. Sorry, John, also, because it's not that you don't work hard, but I must say, you said when Peter retired, he was working part-time. Well, let me tell you that retired Professor Peter Elwood would spend more time in the office than anyone else in the group, for sure. He would be there on Saturdays and Sundays even. But still, you could see his humility behind a lot of things that he would say, most of them excuses. So he would say, I'm Irish. And then he wanted an Argentinian to correct his Irish. He would say, I'm over 50. That was perfect for anything IT related. Yes, that's true. And I'm thinking now, given that this was about 8 or 12 years ago, perhaps now you're saying I'm over 51, right? The other excuse he would use very often was that his only skill was delegation, right? And then what would he do? Of course, he would delegate something to you. Despite all of this humility, I could see real genius in him. And for me, that means a wonderful integration of talent, joy, and commitment with life, not just his own life, but also that of others. And I think this is what you're seeing today as well, with every one of us telling you things about Peter. So what can I say? I enjoyed every second of sharing my office with you, Peter, for 4 years. You're a real friend. You are a real role model for me, and I'm sure for many other people. Perhaps the only thing we don't agree on is that you say that music stopped after Bach. Thank you.
So one of the great unsung heroes of the Caerphilly study is Andrew Beswick. Now, if you want to know anything about Caerphilly blood, this is the man to ask. Platelet tests, lipid tests, antithrombotic tests, and he tells you in great detail. The trouble is, you know, I need to ask him again about 10 minutes later. But Andrew has a fantastic fund of knowledge about early morning clinics, spinning blood in caravans. Yes, this is absolutely true. Spinning blood in caravans, and then discovering, though this might not be the best place to say this, which bag of frozen bloods belong to which part of the study. But we got there in the end, Andrew.
Yes, I'm Andrew Beswick. I'm a researcher at the University of Bristol, working on systematic reviews and randomized trials. This is a picture taken in the early 90s. It's actually when the epidemiology unit moved to Landock Hospital. Here we see Peter Sweetman, Dr. Elwood, and David Poor. Also in the picture is the very large table which Dr. Elwood always had in his office or in the department. It's the largest table I'd ever seen when I travelled for 7 hours for my interview at the Richmond Road, and I was faced with a panel of 11 people around this table. I did not have high hopes on the way home after that, but I did get the job, and in January 1980 started at the Tenemus Institute at the Heath Hospital in Cardiff, measuring steroid hormones on samples from men in phase 1 of the Caerphilly heart study. I met lots of nice people there, including my future wife and children. But Dr. Elwood and John Yarnell had not forgotten about me and thought I should meet all the men in Caerphilly, aged between 45 and 59. This was Bedwas Colliery, one of the mines in the Caerphilly area. And close by is the St. John's Ambulance Hut in Hugh Thomas. This is one of the places where we had morning and evening clinics. That's Paul Hogman, who was one of our first students from Bristol Polytechnic. And here we are again with David and Jim Gilbert, one of the doctors who worked at the unit. On the right is our student Gwyn Bennett, preparing serum and plasma from samples from phase 1. And this is another of the clinic centres. I think this is Bethel Chapel. I'm not certain, actually. You can tell by the bizarre colour schemes that these places had. On the right is one of the Catholic participants having breakfast. And I'm very apologetic. I think the man is probably called Mr. Davis or Mr. Jones, but I can't remember the name. Janie, can you remember who that is?
No.
Pat or something like that?
Carol. Well, that's Carol Eady, the lady.
Carol, right.
Carol Eady.
Yeah. Thank you. Phase 1 of the Catholic study came to an end, so I was needed to look at the steroid hormones. This is in 1983. And I moved from Tenemus to Richmond Road, where I joined young and old in the attic. From the left, there's Priya Vada, myself, there's Barbara, Kim, David, John, and Alan, the student. I discovered the shameful secret when I arrived at Richmond Road that the previous professor had been banished to the attic. He was only let out occasionally to do menial gardening tasks. He was watched on by the MRC staff and photographed by Dr. Elwood. The MRC at Richmond Road, it was like living in the future. There's Janie obviously on the left and Peter Swingham on the right. Peter's probably just checking that the computer's giving the right answers to some complex statistical tests. 1983 was also the year Professor Renaud entered the picture. And with him came the opportunity to make large numbers of tests of platelet activity in phase 2 of the Catholic study. This is his mobile laboratory leaving INSERM in Lyon on its way to the Catholic District Miners Hospital. And here it is with Jan and Karen. And Kim is shown on the right using the aggregometers to measure platelet activity in platelet-rich plasma. Now, unlike Doctor Who's TARDIS, the mobile laboratory is actually smaller on the inside. Well, in fairness, we did start early for 3 days a week. In 1988, the mobile laboratory returned to France and our new facility arrived, which allowed us to have a laboratory, space for a couch for blood taking, a small kitchen, so it was very self-contained. For phase 3 of the Catholic study, Dr. Elwood had acquired a machine which allowed us to look at platelet activity in whole blood, which was thought to be a more realistic measure of how the platelets were behaving in an individual. But we also did the bleeding time to satisfy the old school. On the right is John Yarnell doing the bleeding time. All these bleeding time filter papers are stored in their Canning Hall in Bristol, including a rather bizarre study that Dr. Elwood conducted when he took his own bleeding time every week for years and years. There's this big file full of them.
If anyone wants them,
John O'Brien was a haematologist and expert from Portsmouth, and he was a great friend to the unit. He supported us in so much. He was always the first person to say yes to a meeting. We'd often see it. And he encouraged us to look at the behaviour of platelets under conditions of high shear, which is even more realistic of what's going on in the body. And so we used this equipment that he had designed. By 1993, we'd finished phase 3, and all good things was come to an end. This scrapbook was given to me on my leaving and it's certainly not to be viewed in this company. Things didn't work out for me straight away, but Dr. Owens was really supportive of me and found me a role in the UK Childhood Cancer Study, which it was a fantastic project to work on. He sent me out to count pylons and things like that, for example, here in Merthyr Tydfil. So eventually I did find my way again, but I've been so pleased that he's involved me in further studies over the last 20 years. So thank you very much for that. Can I just finish with an extra few photos? Pickering is actually quite a nice place. It's not just grey and brown as it looks. It's it's a decent place. I'm not sure I would recommend it stay for a weekend, but it's a lovely place in many respects. Then I've just got some pictures of people that we worked with. So this, I think, this was Prof. Cochrane's 75th.
Something like
I think so.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Wood always loved a photo, so we got quite a few of these. There's another one. This was when we left Richmond Road, moved to Landock Hospital. I think some of us had been to the Poets' Corner. And I've just gathered together some pictures of various people, and so lots of people that we've worked with there.
Oh, thank you very much.